It was meant to be our winter of discontent, a season in hell when Europeans, like me, paid the price for daring to oppose Vladimir Putin. Last spring, as Russia all but shut off its gas pipelines, predictions of a dire winter to come flooded the media. With energy prices soaring, inflation took off in America. But it was here in Europe that the worst scenarios were expected to play out. Scenarios like people freezing in their homes, like a double-digit crash in GDP brought on by a collapse of industry, like riots and insurrections as ordinary people rose up against their governments. Yet in the end, none of this happened. While sky-high energy prices did mean winter pinched harder than usual, there was no mass civil unrest, no economic collapse, there weren't even minor blackouts. Across Europe, life carried on more or less like normal. And that raises a pretty vital question. Why? Why did Putin's energy weapon turn out to be such a spectacular dud? Well, in today's episode, we're going to dive into the events of the last 12 months and try and figure out how Russia lost the energy war. A war that almost everyone predicted Putin would win. So, from our vantage point of summer 2023, the panic that flooded the media just a year ago can seem amusingly overblown, like watching a man who's stumped his toe worry that he'll have to amputate his leg. But make no mistake, the dire warnings of last year weren't just the usual hyperbolic guff wafting around social media. Serious people with serious insight really thought that Europe might be approaching a cliff edge, one which could see the support for Ukraine collapse across the bloc. To understand why, we need to look no further than the continent's energy makeup on the eve of war. As 2021 drew to a close, the EU was in the depths of a gas addiction, and just like a regular addiction, it was one Europe's friends could see was taking it to some dangerous places. Across the bloc, roughly a quarter of all energy consumption relied on gas. Of this, close to half came from Russia, totaling an eye-watering 150 billion cubic meters per year. As The Economist wrote with dry understatement, in retrospect, the dependence built up by dozy policymakers and short-sighted businesses on Russian gas was reckless. Really though, it's not only in retrospect that Europe's pre-war energy model seems dangerous. For those paying attention, by winter 2021, it was already worrying. Across that year, gas flows between Russia and Europe had been falling, hitting anomalously low levels. Each time, Russia's state-owned Gazprom was able to come up with a reasonable-sounding excuse, but it was still hard not to notice the impacts that it was having on European storage. The continent, you see, consumes a lot of gas in winter, so much so that simply pumping it through pipelines wouldn't be enough even in ideal conditions. EU countries, therefore, store excess gas over the summer in advance of cold weather. Prior to the war, they usually began each winter with around 100 billion cubic meters held back. Winter 2021, though, began with stores 13% lower than usual, a direct result of Gazprom cutting down flows. Gas prices were surging on the commodity markets. At the same time, Russian tanks were ominously gathering on Ukraine's borders. The message from Putin was clear. If the EU tried to intervene in what happened next, then the continent would face an unprecedented energy crisis, and it was a threat that the autocrat would soon make good on. When war broke out, there were a few short months during which Russian gas continued to flow, and addict countries continued to hope that they wouldn't get cut off. As of late July 2022, Canada was waiving sanctions, so a Montreal company could repair turbines for the Nord Stream gas pipeline to Germany. But as sanctions piled up and Moscow's forces began to suffer setback after humiliating setback, Putin seems to have made his decision. Russia effectively cut off flows to all but a handful of Kremlin-friendly countries like Hungary. It was at this point that the doomsday predictions began. Although the EU had managed to already part-fill its storage tanks, there were serious worries that it wouldn't be enough for winter. Brussels started talking about the need for national gas rationing plans that might see industry shut down at peak times. In some German cities, warming centers were set up where elderly people could escape their cold homes and sit by heaters for a while. If things got bad enough, industry shutdowns were predicted to lead to mass unemployment. Economists foresaw double-digit falls in GDP, far worse than at the height of the financial crisis. The Atlantic even reported a discussion with an anonymous gas industry insider that suggested that the GDPs of Italy and France could take such a beating that Russia would overtake them, becoming second only to Germany among European economies. For a while, things looked pretty catastrophic. In Moscow, Putin must have been feeling pretty pleased with how his secret weapon was working out. Only work out is exactly what his weapon didn't do. Rather than collapse into paralysis, Europe's many nations would rise from the depths of the coming winter stronger than ever. If you'd been scrolling through Russian social media last December, you might have come across a weird little short film. Designed for European consumption, the film purported to show an ordinary family somewhere like Germany or France in the run-up to 3 different Christmases. In the first, before the war, the father gifts his daughter a pet hamster. In the second, in 2022, the family used the hamster to run on a wheel and generate light for their cold, dark home. In the third, set in 2023, the frozen, emaciated family eats the hamster to survive, so devastating have the effects of the Russian gas cutoff bin. Obviously, the short is propaganda, not a prediction of the future. Still, it does show the sort of devastating effects the Kremlin was hoping that its energy weapon might have. Instead, as I can report from personal experience, last winter in Europe was pretty normal. Christmas markets went ahead, pubs were warm and full of light, no one was forced to eat their beloved pets for sustenance. Of course, now, that doesn't mean there were zero impacts from the gas shortfall. As Barron's recorded, surging energy prices put a damper on industry, slowing economic growth. Inflation also ran rampant. And at the same time, Americans were freaking out over 9% inflation. Here in the Czech Republic, it hit 18%. By any stretch of the imagination, things were not great. But compared to what people had been predicting, they were more than manageable. Although Germany went into recession, it was what The Economist called the mildest of technical recessions. And while gas prices shot to an eye-watering €300 per megawatt hour, they've since fallen back to normal levels. According to Politico, natural gas prices hit a 2-year low this June at €24.84 per megawatt hour. As the article noted, quote, "That's close to the 2010s average." For Europe, these slumping prices are a godsend. I can see my energy bills. For Russia, though, they're a massive problem. While Moscow made record amounts of money from the 2022 gas price shock, it's not a trick Putin can repeat every year. Europe has since severely slashed its dependence on Russian energy, even as the continent continues to fill storage tanks for the winter ahead. At the time of recording, gas storage levels across the continent stand at 68%, a crazy high level for this time of year. If things continue this way, they should be 95% full come November, a number which suggests that winter 2023 will be even less of a big deal than the last one. It wasn't supposed to be like this, though. When the scale of the problem first became clear, it looked like Putin had picked his moment perfectly. In France, swaths of the nation's nuclear plants were offline for maintenance. Germany was shutting its last reactors down for good. Droughts had also lowered the amount of energy that could be produced by hydroelectricity. In short, it should have been a perfect storm. Even given that Europe got lucky with a mild winter, that alone shouldn't have been enough to avert catastrophe. What allowed us Europeans to get through Christmas without snacking on a single hamster? Well, the answer lies in the most dramatic set of adjustments the continent has made in decades. When it launched in May of 2022, there were doubts that the REPowerEU plan was going to work. Intended to combat the energy market disruption triggered by Russia's war, it focused on 3 core areas: overall reduction of energy usage, diversification of energy supplies, and extra investment into clean energy. Considering this has to be implemented across 27 countries, the task was absolutely enormous. Nor was it helped by the nature of the EU energy grid, one in which some smaller countries, like the Czech Republic, are massively dependent on re-exported gas from larger nations like Germany. Yet somehow, by a miracle, it totally worked. So, let's start with the first core REPowerEU goal: reduction of energy usage. Across 2022, overall European demand for natural gas was 12% lower than it had been at any point between 2019 and 2021. The drop was especially noticeable in winter. REPowerEU set each nation the goal of cutting consumption in winter months by 15%. According to Energy Monitor, the average wound up being closer to 20%. That this was even possible was thanks to remarkable adaptation from both households and industry. In private homes across the continent, people responded to campaigns asking them to turn their heating down. At the same time, EU governments handed out €800 billion to offset the pain caused by spiking energy prices. To be clear, this was still uncomfortable. In multiple countries, people were hit with grimly expensive bills. I can testify to that, but the subsidies were enough to avoid heat or eat scenarios for most of the population. Likewise, industry managed to adapt without the mass shutdowns that many had expected. As The Economist discovered, most factories managed to wean themselves off gas and onto other fuels. In energy-intensive industries that did experience shutdowns, such as aluminium production, a switch to imports allowed gas consumption to still be cut while also avoiding shortages. At a national level too, regional decisions were made that allowed for a bit of localized pain in exchange for continent-wide gain. This was perhaps most noticeable in Germany, one of the countries that was most addicted to Russian gas. Even though the shortages were enough to cause a mild recession, Berlin still dutifully kept re-exporting its promised gas to European neighbors. Rather than keep their industries humming along at the expense of Czech households, the Germans chose to share. From outside, that might seem a bit like, yeah, well, duh. You can almost imagine people saying, of course they did. Both countries are in the EU. But we can't stress enough how little that could have meant. Just look at the near decade of failed attempts at sharing asylum seekers around the bloc, one in which different countries seem only able to look out for their own interests. Maybe it was the experience of the pandemic which forced EU nations to get better at working together. Maybe the war sharpened leaders' minds. But either way, it worked. And speaking of countries helping each other out, this brings us nicely to Repower EU's second goal, the diversification of energy supplies. For all reducing consumption and spending more on clean energies might have helped, the simple core truth about Europe is that it needs gas. And if that gas isn't going to come from Russia, it needs to come from somewhere else. This is why EU leaders spent 2022 courting nations like Algeria and Azerbaijan, striking deals for increased flows through pre-existing pipelines. But these only added a little extra to the overall total. Where gas moved by pipelines is concerned, the real star of the show was Norway. A European nation that's not in the EU, Norway is blessed with massive energy reserves in the form of offshore oil and gas fields backed up by hydroelectric power. Across 2022, Oslo made sure to share some of that wealth. A new pipeline was inaugurated, capable of pumping 10 billion cubic meters of gas to Europe annually. Offshore exploration was also adjusted to increase gas flows. According to The Atlantic, Norway likewise exported staggering amounts of energy, even when it pushed up Norwegian household bills and pushed the government's ratings down by a quarter. Not that it was Norway alone, though, that saved Europe, or even nations with pipelines. No. A big part of the solution came to Europe in a different way, traveling across the waves in vast, specialized ships from places as far afield as Qatar or America. Ships carrying the energy world's new secret weapon, liquefied natural gas. Often abbreviated to LNG, liquefied natural gas can be transported to any place equipped with specialized terminals for decompressing it out of its liquid form. The word specialized is really key there. With a modern decompression terminal costing something in the region of $500 million, constructing new ones is an expensive and time-consuming process. After all, there's a reason pre-war Europe relied so heavily on Russian pipelines over American LNG despite the security risks. Governments just didn't want to spend the money when they could get cheaper gas from Moscow. Because of this, it was thought last year that LNG would only play a minor role in alleviating Europe's pain in the energy war. After all, ships carrying it are naturally limited by the number of places that they can offload. But LNG didn't play anything like a small role. Instead, the EU surprised everyone by massively boosting its capacity. In Germany alone, 2 new terminals were opened in 2022, with another coming online in 2023. From a normal building time of 3 years, Berlin managed to reduce construction to just 10 months. That is crazy efficient. Not were the Germans the only ones to go all in on liquefied gas. According to the US Energy Information Administration, by 2024, Europe will have 14 new or upgraded terminals, allowing the continent's LNG capacity to expand by a third. For nations that export the stuff, that is extremely good news. Qatar, Egypt, and Angola have all cashed in on Europe's recent thirst for LNG. But perhaps no nation has cashed in quite as hard as the USA. Given they stand on the same side in the Ukraine war, it makes sense that America would help the old continent out. Still, the numbers remain really impressive. American LNG exports to the EU jumped by 143% in 2022, and it seems likely demand will remain high. Perhaps the most remarkable part is that this wouldn't have been possible just 4 years ago. At the start of 2018, America had just 2 export terminals online, with the capacity to deliver only slightly more than a third of what the US can export today. And 2 years before that, America wasn't exporting any LNG. So thanks on behalf of Europe to any Americans watching this. It's the majority of you. And that's another war where you kind of saved our butts. Hopefully we can return the favor someday. Thanks to the influx of LNG, as well as the pipelines from Norway and Azerbaijan and the voluntary drop in consumption, the continent was able to enter winter of 2022 with gas storage filled to 95%. Even if the third Repower EU goal of investing in clean energy hasn't exactly landed. Across winter 2022, the bloc reopened old coal-fired plants. In some nations, this accounted for over 1/10 of their energy needs. Regardless, the clean energy transition remains a live goal for completely replacing Russian gas by 2028. Just recently, Malta chaired a meeting of Mediterranean nations on creating a vast offshore wind farm. Talks are underway with Israel and Egypt for help securing alternatives. But we need to turn our attention away from Europe now for a bit, because after all, this video isn't titled How the EU Won the Energy War. No, it's called How Russia Lost the Energy War, and we chose to title it that way for a reason, because it wasn't just due to Europe and its allies that the bloc didn't freeze this winter. It's also thanks to catastrophic missteps by Moscow. So, here's a counterintuitive question. Which nation is currently responsible for fulfilling 10% of European gas demand? Yep, the answer is Russia. Despite switching off the taps, Moscow continues to supply natural gas to the EU, half via pipelines and half in the form of LNG. Now, this isn't quite as crazy as it might appear. Firstly, Russia is still profiting off of these deliveries, and secondly, they're often going to nations like Hungary or Austria, which are desperately trying to maintain friendly ties with Moscow. Cut them off, and any leverage that the Kremlin has left in the EU evaporates. Still, it's a nice kicking off point for discussing this chapter's key issue: how cutting off supplies to Europe may have ultimately done more damage to Russia. From having an iron grip on half the European natural gas market, the Kremlin is now watching the trifling 10% that it has left go slipping through their fingers. As Tom Marzek-Manser, head of global gas analytics at ICIS, recently told Politico, there'll be no political mandate to buy bucket loads of Russian gas even if the political situation changes. Nobody out there is going to go and sign a new contract with Gazprom in any significant volume. And that is a serious long-term problem, because the Russian economy is hardly what you would call balanced. It relies on extracting hydrocarbons, then shipping and selling those hydrocarbons to other nations. By permanently cutting themselves off from their largest export market, the Russians have not just shot themselves in the foot, they've blown their leg off. Or as the Atlantic rather dryly put it, Russian leaders had assumed that their pipelines to Europe would make the continent dependent on Russia. They did not apparently consider that the same pipelines also made Russia dependent on Europe. In 2022, that dependency wasn't so noticeable. Record price surges meant the Kremlin still turned a fat profit despite pumping far less gas to Europe. But as prices fall and more time passes, those fat profits are going to decline. Across 2022, Russian gas exports to the entire world fell by 25%, driven by the embargo on Europe. The bad news for Putin? There's no one out there to replace those EU customers. Right now, Moscow is making a big show of its ability to sell gas to China. There's even a new pipeline under construction, the Power of Siberia 2. The trouble is, that pipeline will take years to finish. Until then, there's only a single pipe for sending gas to East Asia, meaning the amount Beijing is able to buy is limited by physical capacity. Even when the new pipeline roars to life, it still won't be pumping as much as the network once did to Europe, nor will it command anywhere near the same prices. Gas in China simply sells for much less than it does in Europe, and since the Chinese know Putin can't sell elsewhere, they can effectively dictate what they're willing to pay. As chairman of the Russian Union of Oil and Gas Producers, Yuri Shafranik has admitted, to quote, "The loss of European gas market for Russia is a serious problem. Of course, Russia isn't only capable of shifting gas-fired pipelines, though, like the USA, it has the ability to export LNG. Sadly for the Kremlin, it can only do so at a limited capacity. Constructing a gas compression terminal to export LNG is even more expensive and technically challenging than building the decompression terminals. While a single German decompression terminal costs $500 million, the new suite of compression terminals America is planning to build on the Gulf Coast will come in at $10.5 billion. That's about as much as the James Webb Space Telescope, and it's almost as technologically complicated. Anyone wishing to build one of these things needs access to massive amounts of investment, plus high-end Western technology. Under sanctions, Russia has neither of these things. According to CNBC, that means Russia's share of the global LNG market is likely to shrink in the coming years from 7 to 5%. This is what we mean when we say Russia lost the energy war. Not only did Putin fail to freeze Europe into submission, he also created a set of conditions that will make his country poorer and less relevant in the long run. The fact that a big chunk of the European energy market is now reorienting towards one of his enemies, America, well, that's just the cherry atop a big fat cake of schadenfreude. But while this video has been a little bit of a victory lap so far, we don't want to only cover the positives, because while Europe might have survived last winter, there are some people out there who think the continent is not out of the woods yet, that Putin's energy weapon may not have lived up to expectations, but may well still cause untold damage. By most people's reckoning, Europe can today be said to have survived the energy crisis. According to Barron's, quote, "The International Energy Agency suggests that Europe's efforts to reduce gas demand should be sufficient to cover a complete cut-off of Russian gas next winter, even in a stress scenario." At the same time, there are signs that the EU has cornered the LNG buying market. At the height of the crisis in 2022, the continent saw its LNG imports jump 63%. At the same time, India and Bangladesh saw their imports slump 17% and Pakistan by even more. This is important because Pakistan in 2022 went through an acute energy crisis of its own. The fact that it lost out on LNG to Europe suggests the EU has the money to simply outbid everyone else in case of shortfalls. Obviously, if you're an ordinary person in Pakistan, this kind of sucked. You're left trying to figure out why Russia being mad at Europe means you have unaffordable energy bills. But sucky or not, it's a sign that Europe could pull through next winter, even if Putin stops those last shipments of gas to Hungary and co., especially considering the additional LNG terminals that are sprouting up along the continent's shorelines like metallic mushrooms. Still, look, we have a job to do with this video, and we wouldn't be doing it if we didn't now give you the other side. The side that says, maybe these celebrations are a tad premature, Europe. One reason for pessimism? The sheer unpredictability of the weather. If last winter was unexpectedly mild, there's nothing to say the coming winter won't be the sort of once-in-a-generation Siberian hellbeast that plunges temperatures to agonizing lows. Now, that alone might not be enough to cause a crisis. Gas storage is already on track to exceed last year's levels. But if it combines with other freakish weather, well, then that might be trouble. A big problem could be a serious drought this summer. As Energy Monitor has noted, a few dry months would severely reduce the ability of hydroelectric dams and nuclear plants to produce energy. Combine this with a swelteringly hot summer, forcing people to waste energy using aircon, and, well, Europe might burn through that comfortable surplus that it's been building. Nor is this an abstract threat. The French Geological Survey, for example, thinks France will be hit by a bad drought this summer. At the same time, there are other storm clouds on the horizon, even if some of them initially look like rainbows. Take falling energy prices. A big part of this video has been covering the sharp drop of prices back to pre-invasion levels. A clear win, right? Well, not for the writers at Energy Monitor. From their perspective, the savings European households and industries brought in last year weren't out of solidarity with Ukraine, they were out of fear of crippling energy bills. As those fears fade, the thinking goes, Europeans might start being all like, great, let's celebrate by cranking the aircon and heating simultaneously and see which one wins. If the reductions of last year aren't kept up this summer, then the ability to fill gas storage to 95% prior to winter will be severely impacted. And there are fewer extra sources now to take up the slack. In an eye-watering display of ideology blinding strategic good sense, Germany shut down its remaining nuclear plants in 2023 because, it's not like there's a massive energy war going on. Go off in the comments, Germans. The last potential storm clouds are swirling around LNG. Back in 2022, one of Europe's surprise suppliers of LNG was China. Not that Beijing was doing so out of the goodness of Xi Jinping's heart. At the time, the CCP was still pursuing its zero-COVID strategy. That meant huge industrial shutdowns, meaning that China was stuck with piles of LNG it had already paid for but didn't need. Reselling the stuff to Europe at profit was good for everyone. This year, though, zero COVID is in the rearview mirror, and that means Beijing will be willing to pay more for LNG. And while the EU might be able to outbid Pakistan for gas outbidding China, that's a different matter. Still, these aren't deal breakers. They're something European policy leaders need to keep in mind, certainly, but not some impending catastrophe. So as we end today's video, then, it's in a curious place, with Russia seemingly defeated in an energy war that Putin recklessly gambled on winning. For people like me living here in the EU, the limited impacts last winter were a godsend. If we really do get through next winter unscathed, it'll be a cause for celebration. Any long-term damage to Russia's economy, it's just going to be a glorious bonus. Because make no mistake, this energy war will prove to be just as transformative to everyone's futures as the real war happening in Ukraine. Not in the sense of destroying cities or carving up lands, but in the sense that it represents a total break with the past. A doorway through which none of us can ever return. A reordering of the entire Europe-Russia relationship. What effects this will have 5, 10, 20 years from now are something we will just have to wait to find out.